25 years ago, gunshots erupted inside a Colorado high school, destroying lives and forever changing beliefs about school safety in the United States. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. April 20th, 1999. It's a day etched in the memories of many Americans who watched 24-hour news coverage of a mass shooting at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. 2 gunmen shot and killed 12 fellow students and a teacher and injured 24 others. Since then, mass shootings at schools have happened with numbing frequency across the United States. We begin with this report from CGTN's Hendrik Sebrundi.
On the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Columbine High School massacre, people came to a Denver church to remember the 12 students and 1 teacher who died in the shootings and to honor their families.
Unfortunately, we kind of look at anniversaries, by those magical numbers.
Tom Mauser was among the parents whose children did not come home 25 years ago.
911, what's your emergency?
Apparently there's been a shooting up here at Columbine High School.
Somebody in a black trench coat with a shotgun just shooting at the school.
Here's how I reported it back on April 20th, 1999.
Happy!
In an instant, a quiet Littleton neighborhood turned into a scene of complete chaos.
I was at a shopping mall, and my wife called and said that there'd been a shooting.
Daryl Scott lost his daughter, Rachel.
I was not prepared for what I heard. You know, your heart begins to sink after the last bus pulls up and your child's not on it.
Daniel Mauser was another of the 12 students killed.
My son would be 40 years old. I just can't grasp that. To me, he's still 15.
He says Columbine was a transformational event for America. He asked an audience recently,
how many of you remember where you were or what you were doing when you got the news about Columbine? And nearly all of them, they were mostly older people, raised their hands. You know, it had a great impact on a lot of people.
The shooting sparked an intense debate over gun violence that's ongoing. Mauser became a gun safety activist, a role he never imagined. Although he says the country remains awash in firearms, he believes progress has been made. Better school security, more mental health funding, and soon more background checks on buyers at gun shows.
It's great that we have this, but we shouldn't have to wait another 25 years to see additional change.
The past 25 years have seen struggles in the Columbine community. For a student who wrote her name in the ceiling that day, thinking she was going to die, it's also been a time of healing.
I've had 25 years to have debilitating anxiety attacks, but now I know how to get out of them, and I know how to work through them.
This anniversary, many say, is an opportunity to spread a message of hope.
There's been foundations set up in the honor of these kids, and I think that's the important thing, and I think that's what Columbine represents, is hope.
Mauser is encouraged that more young people have gotten involved in tackling gun violence. He hopes Columbine doesn't fade into the background once this anniversary is over. He says there's more work to be done.
The story is not over. The story is not over.
Hendrik Sebrundi, CGTN, Littleton, Colorado.
For more now on Columbine and gun violence in the United States, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Tallahassee, Florida, is Benjamin Dowd-Arrow. He's an Associate Director of the Public Health Program at Florida State University. From Maryland, Joseph Williams is a former Senior Editor with U.S. News and World Report. Also with us from Georgia, Bill Crane is a political analyst and columnist, and Craig Scott is a Columbine survivor and inspirational speaker. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Craig, great to have you with us. Thanks for your time. Let me start with you. We just heard from your father in that report by our correspondent. You lost your sister, Rachel Joy Scott. She was killed in the shooting along with 2 of your close friends, 2 of your classmates, in fact, on that day 25 years ago. I know you must think about your loss. You and your family must think about your loss every day. But what do you remember today on the 25th anniversary of what happened there?
Yeah, being the 25th marker year of the Columbine shooting, it was one of the first mass school shootings of its kind, and it really did have an impact, especially as the news media focused in on what had happened, and a lot of people that are old enough to remember do remember where they were, what they were doing that day. And that day I was in the library at the school where most of the shooting happened. I was in the room where 10 had lost their life. I had 2 friends that were killed next to me, and I barely escaped. To learn later on that my sister was the first one that was killed right outside the school. And since then, my family and I have been working mostly in schools and trying to impact the culture of schools, and we've prevented a number of school shootings from happening, thousands of suicides. And so I'll continue to do the work as long as it's making an impact.
So you work continuously to try and prevent a recurrence of this happening again. And when you think of your sister Rachel, how do you remember her?
But she was just authentic. She was very real. She was 17. I was 16. She was a year older, and she made it a point to step out of her way for kids that weren't as cool or popular. You know, at that age, kids, teenagers really care a lot about what their peers think of them, and they want to fit in. And Rachel, she stepped out of her way for people that nobody else thought was important. She wrote about this. She wrote an essay a month before she died, talking about starting a chain reaction of kindness and compassion. And she kept a lot of journals in her life. She had 7 journals at the time of her death. And she had a lot of really deep things to say for a 17-year-old girl, even to this day, that I've shared with over 1 million students in person. And things about being true to who you are, looking for the good in other people, not being quick to judge or label, showing mercy and forgiveness to people who have wronged you. She talked about this idea of starting a chain reaction of kindness and compassion. And at the same time that she wrote this essay in her class at Columbine, the 2 shooters, Eric and Dylan, had made that month before the shooting a videotape in their parents' basement without their parents knowing. It was never released to the public. I'm glad it wasn't. But they talked about their plans, what they wanted to do, and they were very dramatic. And near the end of the video, one of them picked up a sawed-off shotgun that he used to kill my friend Isaiah that was next to me with, and he pointed it at the camera and said, "We need to kickstart. We need to get a chain reaction going here." And so they wanted, their part of their goal was to start a chain reaction of school shootings. And so I kind of give this double challenge down to people and teens when I speak about what kind of chain reactions are you starting every day. We can give life positive chain reactions that words or actions impact others, or we can, start negative chain reactions.
Benjamin, let's look at the situation right now. The Pew Research Center, they surveyed public school teachers from kindergarten all the way through grade 12, and they found that 1 in 4 teachers experienced a gun-related lockdown during the 2022-2023 school year. I mean, that's just a year ago. 69% of teachers say better mental health care would be highly effective in preventing school shootings. I would imagine better health care as well, that'll just be one component of a more comprehensive plan to deal with this problem of school shootings. But what are the lessons of Columbine? I mean, have these programs been formulated? Have they been implemented? Have they made a change?
So since Columbine, we have gone through several different iterations of how to handle these kinds of events. Columbine was the first really to change the way that we approach these types of events. Prior to that, it was always the hide idea, and unfortunately that caused a lot of harm in Columbine, where students hid under desks. And then we had, the Virginia Tech event happen, and the combination of those 2 shootings led to the run, hide, fight method that is used now, led to some of the lockdown practices that we've seen since Sandy Hook, and more recent shootings. But thinking about like how teachers are impacted, just last week in Texas, a teacher that I know was in 2 separate active shooter lockdowns on the premises, where one was a drive-by shooting and was shooting into the school playground. So I don't know how effective these things have really been when we see that since Columbine has happened, how many of these events have we had? And like, if you look at, we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of Uvalde, where we had, you know, children who were killed by a man with a gun, 400 officers on hand at one point, and unable to stop him. So I don't know that we have come that far in resolving this with what we're doing, because of the ease of access to get firearms. And as mentioned by the teachers, we do need better health, mental health services, but we don't really fund that. Insurance doesn't really cover it.
Yeah, I want to get to that shooting in Uvalde in a moment. Joseph Williams, Columbine, sadly, was not the deadliest school shooting, but it came at a time when 24-hour news networks like CNN, like Fox, like MSNBC was in their ascendancy. That was the age when we could see everything 24 hours. It was happening in real time right before us in our living rooms. How did that kind of news coverage change the public awareness of these kinds of shootings at schools?
Well, it was dramatic. It was shocking. It was something certainly that the American public had not been used to ever before. So that left an indelible impression. I mean, to this day, you ask people, you mention the word Columbine to people, and they automatically understand what you mean. And it's tragic that a school is a stand-in for one of the deadliest acts to occur on American soil at that point, committed by young people with access to deadly weapons and firearms. So I think the saturation coverage of the news media was only natural because that's kind of what we do. It's sensational, it's unusual, it's something that every parent could relate to. As a matter of fact, your correspondent mentioned everybody knows where they were. I certainly recall that my daughter had just been born at that time, and she's grown up in an era where there has been school shootings, at least school shootings across the country, but that has fomented these kind of drills that I think in schools that kind of can cause some low-key trauma. But certainly I think it erupted and sent us catapulting in the era of mass shootings. And that's something that we still quite haven't recovered from. And I think in a way it might have even normalized this. The more often it happened and the more sensational the coverage was, the more shocking it got to be and the more reactions we got, i.e. hardening schools and creating these active shooter drills that really basically has become a part of, as much a part of school curriculum as lunch or gym class.
Bill Crane, great to see you, Bill. President Biden has again called for a ban on assault weapons, and this call comes after a shooting in North Carolina last week. In that particular incident, a suspect who was being served with a warrant fired at police officers with a high-powered rifle, killing 4 of them, injuring 4 others. Later, they found an AR-15 in the house where this suspect was at the time, and a .40 caliber handgun. They were recovered from that house. Why has it been so difficult to impose some kind of control on who would have access to these kinds of weapons?
Well, part of it's simply logistics. And first, I just want to say to Mr. Scott and his family for the loss they suffered. We're with you, as well as the thousands of other Americans who have had their family members killed, and then those who've survived these shootings. I've got 2 children. One is a school teacher, one is in high school. And between the 2 of them, they've been through 6 lockdowns already this calendar year, thankfully. No shooting, thankfully. No one was injured, but you just don't know. I think we need to remember, and I'm not trying to be clever here, there's not any one single shot legislatively, gubernatorially, that can be fired that can eradicate this problem. I think it's a multi-pronged. Here in Georgia, where Mr. Scott and I now reside, the state has invested in the last 2 legislative cycles new money, $750 million in mental illness initiatives and funding. We do know that most of these shootings have been conducted by younger, angry, isolated from society, in their words, white males. We don't know necessarily entirely why, but I'd say these things have a little to do with it. I've got two children again, one of whom is a digital native. She's much more comfortable communicating via text and with a phone than sometimes face-to-face with her peers, or certainly with educators. And when there's bullying and when there's things that occur, striking back you start to go into fantasy mode. So I think we need to look at a host of things. I think video gaming and what it allows our children to fantasize about is problematic. And I think there are some very easy, low-hanging fruit on gun control reform that haven't been passed into law yet, but we ought to talk about the loophole that exists for private gun sales and gun shows. We need to do more in the near term about not just counting and registering every weapon that we have, but requiring at time of purchase or before purchase training and use of the firearm, because we often find that sometimes if you're required to learn how to use it, you will not make that purchase on an impulse. There are things that can be done. Some have, more can be, as the other father during the video earlier said. But this is a country that likes gun ownership. In the state of Georgia that I am, there are a lot of rifle owners. I happen to be one. I happen to own a handgun. I've never fired either at a human being, but I have had training, and if pressed, if my family was under attack or my home was being burglarized and someone wouldn't leave on a warning shot, I'd use the weapon.
Joseph Williams, as Bill says, any solution to what is a very serious problem in the country, it's a serious threat, would have to be multi-pronged. It would probably involve education, healthcare, as well as legislation. But would it be fair to say that a lot of the blame for this epidemic of gun violence that we see around the country can be attributed to the fact that there has not been meaningful action at the federal level, especially in the U.S. Congress?
Well, I think that's on the contrary. There's been zero meaningful action, and on the contrary, there's been expansion of gun ownership and expansion of access to weapons. I mean, you need to look no further than Nashville, the latest major school shooting. Or I shouldn't even say that because there's probably one that I'm forgetting, but we've got all these school shootings where you can basically call them by shorthand. But in Nashville, the young people rallied to the state's capital to try to demand that lawmakers do something, and that something they felt was restrictions on firearms, but the lawmakers did nothing. They accessed a little bit more mental health care. Yeah, that's fine. But the country is awash in guns. A lot of people who have them don't really need them. And I think that that's been the most difficult challenge, is that, Bill's right, we love our guns, and that love of guns is problematic on a lot of levels. We're the only Western industrialized nation that has this problem, and we're the only industrialized nation where there are more guns in circulation than there are people. And I think that you have a disproportionate power dynamic, particularly in states in the Midwest and rural states, where they have a disproportionate amount of power in Washington that allows them to continue to have unfettered access to, allow people to have continued unfettered access to guns, because there's where the power lies. And that's despite the fact that most opinion polls believe that guns should be more tightly restricted, and that statistics show that if people own guns, they are more likely to be used in a suicide or an accidental death than in self-defense of a home. And I think that's a problem that we have not been able to solve. I don't imagine it's going to be solved anytime soon. And until it is, we're going to keep having these incidents happen one after the other.
Craig.
With a lot of respect for Mr. Williams and his perspective, I would just point back out that we have in Mexico a gun problem. A lot of countries in Latin America where gun ownership is not legal, the outlaws have guns, and whether they're part of a drug syndicate or another criminal enterprise, they terrify the people who are native population. In Asia, it's very typical in most countries to be walking through an airport and to see both police and military personnel carrying AK-47s or like assault weapons. So yes, Western Europe has some very strong gun control legislation and very restricted gun ownership, but I wouldn't say it's true of the entire Western.
Bill, with all due respect, we're not Latin America and we're not Southeast Asia, and the guns that Mexican drug lords are using are coming from the United States. I mean, that's a fact. And there's a drug pipeline on I-95 where drugs are coming from unfettered access states where you can buy a gun in a vending machine to centers of population like Chicago, New York, DC, where I live, and that's causing a lot of the routine drumbeat gun violence that we don't really talk much about.
Okay, I need to move on. I want to get back to Craig. Craig, there was a report in the Washington Post, and according to that report, 370,000 students have experienced gun violence in the 25 years since the Columbine shootings. On February 14th, 2018, a teen gunman killed 14 students and 3 adults at the Marjorie Stoneman High School in Parkland, Florida. Jacqueline Corinne, who co-founded the youth movement March for Lives, describes that shooting and how it changed her life. Let's listen.
I was expecting to die that day. A lot of people were expecting to die that day. And a moment like that really changes you. It makes you reconsider what life is, what life looks like, what it means to you and to the people around you. And no child, which is what I was at the time, should experience that, period. But unfortunately, thousands of kids, all of the students who attended my high school that day, felt that same feeling. And for many of us, that was the day our childhood ended.
So, Craig, how did the Columbine shootings impact you personally? I mean, you are a filmmaker right now. You are an inspirational speaker as well. What is the message that you take to students and parents around the country?
Well, I would say that it is not a one-shot solution, just like Bill said. I've looked in the face of 50, 60,000 teenagers over the last 25 years that have told me one-on-one after I've spoken at events, schools, and conferences, the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So how do you reach somebody that's in a dark place, that's got hatred in their heart, that has let anger build to the point that they're so disconnected and isolated that they would step out to hurt someone? And I have to say that since Columbine, the big story, the two revolving things that come up again and again, which is really, there was a false narrative that came out after Columbine, and that was that the shooting happened because these guys were pushed to the edge because they were bullied so bad at school. But the two things that again come up and again, which are important things, but I don't think they're at the heart of this issue. And that is guns, and that is bullying. Both of those are again important factors. But I'm focused on reaching the hearts of young people. And how do you get someone that is in this hateful place, and how do you get people to step out in compassion for people like this? How do we impact? And mental health is a deeper issue. Yeah. To me than the gun itself. Again, and I don't own a gun. I'm for legislation that can help to help put up roadblocks. But if somebody wants to take the time, plan out for a year how to kill people, how to take their life, we've got to address what's going on in the hearts and minds of young people. And so I do that through the power of storytelling. Yeah. Stories, we remember stories 10 times more than we can just information. And there's a lot of legislation that's already been passed. And the shooters at Columbine specifically, they broke all the legislation. They got their legally anyway. And I love Dan Nowser's father, Tom. He is a friend of mine, and he is on this passion with gun control. But that's not more my focus, because I believe the deeper issue is happening, what is happening on the mental health, and I would say a spiritual level with young people in this country. And I know that our program has prevented 10 documented school shootings and thousands of suicides. And so I know that we have an effective way of reaching that level. It's through the power of story and speaking into giving life into an encouragement. And I'll end with this, one of the main messages that I have for kids is I watched as two friends were killed next to me, and I escaped. My sister was killed. And one of the things that Columbine taught me was how important people are, and the value of a person's life. And so one of the things I talk to kids about when they're in this, the bigger issue than school shootings, which the chances of a student or educator dying in a school shooting is 0.000035, and they have a much more higher likely chance to die just by getting into the car that day. But bigger issue than that is suicide. And so I try to speak into life. And so my main message is you have this incredible inherent built-in value. Yeah. believe that about yourself. It's not an egotistical thing where you're better than others, but you have this incredible value that you're built with. Believe that about yourself. So these are the kinds of things. I also talk about choosing positive influences. I talk about issues of the heart that would allow somebody to let go of dwelling on anger and negativity. And Bill brought up another good point, and that is about the media and technology. If all the social programs, all of that can lead people to actually being more isolated. Nothing can replace in-person relationships with other people, and we have to come back to some basic things with kids. And so it is a multi thing. Guns are a very important issue, but I have to say, in my work, that has not been my primary focus.
Benjamin, you know, as I said in the introduction to the show, mass shootings take place in the United States with numbing frequency. We have been talking to some of the survivors. I mean, Craig is a survivor of one of those shootings. We heard from Jacqueline Corrin, who's also a survivor from one of those shootings. What about therapy for the survivors? Is there sufficient care for them?
You know, they care for each other, and I'm sure Craig could talk really well on this. I'm friends with a lot of the survivors or families of victims from some of these events in the more recent years. One of my good friends lost his son at Uvalde. And so, you know, they have come together for themselves, but there's, you know, they're having to find those resources together. They're not readily apparent. You know, to go touch back on what everybody is saying, I agree, it is a multi-pronged approach. And to add to what has been said, I think one of the biggest barriers to seeing any form of reform for what we see with gun violence in this country is the money in politics. Following Parkland, Marco Rubio was confronted by some of the survivors, and he said he would never refuse to take NRA money. And that is a conflict of interest with what, as we've mentioned, that the American people are overwhelmingly want, you know, better gun control. When we look at, you know, the things we could do and what has been done, we know that states with stricter laws have fewer of these events. They have fewer mass shootings, fewer homicides, fewer suicides, and fewer accidental deaths. Like Mississippi is the supreme in the last bit of data that came out, and they have no major cities. So it is, as mentioned, the power of these smaller states and the lobbying of these groups that don't have the interests of the American people at heart that are creating this continued event.
Benjamin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us on this show. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.